two things I want to do today, kind of two separate things, and we can roll this all into a single project, but the main two things that I want to do today, the first one being gesture recognizers, and then the second one being system view controllers. They're unrelated, I would say. So I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to call it gesture recognizers. Gesture recog. I had to look at that spelling for a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going to save that on the desktop. And if I go over to my storyboard and I open up my Object Explorer, there's all sorts of gesture recognizers. Okay, so if I want to tap, if I want to pinch or rotate or swipe or pan, I have never used the screen edge pan gesture recognizer, to be honest with you. Long press, I've never had a need to use a custom gesture recognizer either. But gesture recognizers come up quite a bit. So let's say I wanted to make an image a button, right? So maybe I've hired some graphic designer to create buttons for my application, and I want some specific theme for my application. I don't want to use the standard iOS buttons. Like, I've decided that my application is going to look different, my buttons are going to look different. So I've hired someone to say, hey, you know, can you make these images into buttons? Okay, so let's handle that. So I'm going to attach a UI image view. And I want to attach some image. So I was looking for images over the weekend, and like I was looking at Verona logos. So let's grab this Verona Wrestling logo. So this is my Verona area wrestling logo that I'm going to attach to that UI image view. So I should be able to come over to the image view and say that is my image. You can see I have some scaling issues, so instead of scale to fill, I'm going to do aspect fill. Make it actually large enough to handle the image. Maybe. I actually don't think I have to do anything with the size. I think it'll be fine. Okay, so UI image view, and I want to be able to click on this image. The first thing I have to do, and this is something that you're going to forget time and again, is this image view has to have user interaction enabled. It's not enabled by default. So I want to make sure I enable it. And I can do this through code, or I can do this in my storyboard. Either way is fine. But I need to set that. So just kind of to clarify things, if I have a reference to this image, so just my logo, in the Viewdidload, I could have taken the logo, and then there's a is user interaction enabled property that I could set to true. So I could do that programmatically as well. But don't forget to do it, otherwise your gesture recognizers are not going to work. You're going to be like, what the heck, I've coded this right, it should be working, and it's not going to be working. Okay, so then I want to be able to double tap on it. Okay, so a button, but I got to be able to double click on or double tap on the button on the image. Okay, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go back to the storyboard. I'll close the assistant editor. And there's a tap gesture recognizer. I'm going to drag and drop it on the image view. I don't have to do it this way. This is one way to set up these gesture recognizers. I'll show you a couple different alternate versions of this, but I'm going to drag and drop it, and it's going to be associated with that image view. So I'm dragging and dropping it so that there is a relationship there. Okay, you'll see that I have this tap gesture recognizer. If I click on the logo and look at the relationships, you'll see that I have a gesture recognizers collection. Everyone see that? So what we're really talking about is that tap gesture recognizer is associated with this specific logo. Okay? So then we want to do something programmatically when they double tap on the logo. Like that's what this gesture recognizer is there for. We want to respond to that. It's essentially an event handler that we're setting up for our image. I can't go into my assistant editor and say, oh, I want you to take that logo and I want to drag some action. You'll notice there is no option to create an action there, so I can't click it. It's not a button that responds to an action. So like that's most people's initial reaction is like, I have that image view, I'm just going to create an action for when it's touched. You can't. Okay, so not an option. So instead, what we want to do is we want to have an event handler for our gesture recognizer. Okay, so we're going to have a logo tapped function. And then it's going to take one parameter, which is a sender. So I'm going to take a sender, which is going to be a UI tap gesture recognizer. Like that's the function that it's going to respond to. If I want that to be an action, I can mark it as an IB action. And again, there's a couple of ways to handle this, but that's the way I want to do it for now. So I'm marking it as an IB action that can be triggered from that gesture recognizer. And now I want to wire these things together. I want this tap gesture recognizer to trigger this action. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to control drag from the tap gesture recognizer to the view controller. And it's going to say, hey, there's this logo tapped with sender. That's the event that I want to actually get triggered. Okay, and if we want to verify things are working, logo tapped. So now, if we run this, we should be in pretty good shape if I've wired this up correctly. Every time I do this, I'm like, is that the right way to do it?
Can you just drag the gesture recognizer over to your function, or do you have to go to the view controller?
I have to go to the view controller because that's what sets up the delegate.
Oh.
And we'll talk about this when we actually programmatically do this. So a lot of things actually happened as a result of us doing this through the storyboard. But if I click on this now, you'll see I get that logo tapped. Okay, so every time I tap it, I'm getting the logo tapped, and that's not necessarily what I want. I want to double click on this. So I don't want just a single click. I want it to make it a double click. The way I can handle that then is I'm still in the assistant editor. I can have an outlet to that gesture recognizer. So I have that logo tap gesture. And then I can take that logo tap gesture and set the number of taps required equal to 2. Okay, so now if I run this, and I know you can't see this, I don't know that there's a way for me to highlight my mouse. I'm sure there is, but I'm clicking on this once, nothing happens. It figures out that it has to be 2 consecutive taps. Like, so there is, like, if I create enough time delay, it won't capture that second tap. Again, I have no control over how quickly it's going to, like, discard that first tap. Like, that's an iOS thing. So, like, I'm double tapping, and it's showing up. You can't change it. Like, it's an iOS setting in terms of how quickly it's going to discard that first tap. So far, so good. Let's try this a different way. Okay, so I want to do the same thing. I want to have the same exact result, but I want to do this all programmatically as opposed to using the storyboard to do it. Okay, so same event handler, that'll stay. That's no big deal. But I'm not going to have an outlet to the tap gesture. So let me go ahead and delete those things. I want to make sure that I get rid of the outlets. Okay, so that's all gone. I still want a reference to the logo, but I think the logo does not have any gesture recognizer, so that's good. So I think the only thing I have left is just this logo tapped function that is not wired to anything. I'm going to delete the gesture recognizer from the storyboard. And I just want to verify that it's still running. So everything's gone. So we built it up through the storyboard. Everything's gone now. If I click on this, nothing's happening. Okay, I can assure you that I'm clicking on it. It's just a UI image view at this point. Okay, so I want to go through that kind of same exercise, but now I want to do it all programmatically. Okay, so in the Viewdidload, I'm going to create a new, let's get rid of the assistant editor for the time being. In the Viewdidload, I'm going to create a UI tap gesture recognizer. So I'll call it my logo tapped gesture. So let logo tap gesture equals a UI tap gesture recognizer. So as I bring up the parens, it says, oh, you have to fill in some details about this tap gesture recognizer. What's the target? Okay, so the logo typically, but really what we're, like, I need a, typically it's the parent view, like the container for that logo. So in our case, it's going to be ourself. And it's complaining about the arguments. So the target will be self. And then the action is what should happen when this gesture recognizer, or this tap gesture, actually occurs. This action, right? That's what we want to say. So when this gesture recognizer is triggered, we want this action to execute. So it's almost like setting up an event handler. So I'm saying, hey, when this thing happens, this code should execute. So you'll notice it says, oh, you should give me a selector. The selector syntax is a pain. Okay, so the way the selector syntax is going to work is I'm going to use pound selector. And then I pass in self.logo tapped. That's the action. Okay, it's telling me, hey, you never used it. I'm going to use it, so we're just not there yet, but the warning's fine. Okay. So basically saying when that gesture recognizer gets triggered, this is the code that should get executed, this logo tapped. Okay. Life's good so far? So we create that gesture recognizer. I need to attach it to the logo. Like right now, it's just a variable, not attached to anything. It's just kind of floating in the wind. I want it to be attached to the logo. So I'm going to take the logo, and I'm going to add a gesture recognizer, which will be my logo tap gesture.
Within that selector action, you've got a sender tag that isn't described. You have to have a sender self or sender.
It'll automatically send that gesture. So you never specify it. It'll automatically send the gesture recognizer. Yeah, so the syntax is awful because it used to be that these gesture recognizers were Objective-C gesture recognizers. They're written in Objective-C. So you had to mark all of your functions as @obj-C. That's the only way they could get triggered, and that was kind of like a known result. So now you can get away from that a little bit, but
So that's their way of doing function handling.
I would call them event handlers, yeah. Yeah. Before we add this tap gesture recognizer, I also want to add the delegate being itself. Now, this is all done for you in the storyboard. So when we just kind of dragged and dropped these actions, it all happened for you. Why can I not do that? Because this needs to be a UI gesture recognizer delegate. I don't think I actually have to code anything for this to make it a delegate. I think that's it. Sorry, one last thing. So if I want this to require 2 taps again, so now we're programmatically doing the same thing. I think it's easier the other way, but like to just do it through the storyboard. It used to not be possible to do it through the storyboard, so you'll end up seeing a lot of gesture recognizers programmatically added just because of like historical reasons. Like it wasn't available to do through the storyboard. Like you couldn't kind of drag and drop these gesture recognizers, but now you can. It's a good question. I couldn't give you an exact date. Like where I was writing gesture recognizers, it was still Objective-C, so it was before Swift. But I don't know that it changed necessarily, but like right when Swift came out. Because I mean, there's still code where I'll see Swift code, so Swift 3 code where they'll have like the gesture recognizer event handlers as Objective-C functions. So you'll still see it. I think if I even take off this IB action, it's going to complain, saying, hey, you need to mark this as Objective-C. Like, that's their recommended fix. And, like, if you look at Apple's documentation, that's their recommended fix. So, I see most people marking them as interface builder actions. Okay, so the tap gesture recognizer. Let's handle panning. Okay, so panning is really just drag and drop. Okay, that's what I want to handle. And I actually was playing around with this over the weekend. I'm like, oh, I could give you a good example. So the example that I want to use is, let's assume that I was looking at like files on a file system. And so let's add some image views. So I want 2 image views, one to be my file, and then a second, which will be a trash can. And I have those logos already on my desktop. So if I go over to my desktop, I have like a PDF logo and a trash logo. So I'm just going to drag those into my application. So here's the PDF, here's the trash can. Okay, so just icons, really. And I want to put those onto my storyboard, so here's the PDF, and then here's my trash can. Okay. And I want to set up a pan gesture recognizer on this PDF. Okay, so I can drag and drop the PDF. So let's start with that. Okay, this code is a little bit more complicated because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to have a pan gesture recognizer. It's going to trigger an event to say, hey, you're dragging and dropping. And like to describe that process to you, what we're going to get is a translation, like an X and Y coordinate, like how much has X and Y changed for whatever we're panning. So in our case, this image. So as we're dragging this image, we're going to get a translation saying, hey, the X coordinates changed by this much, the Y coordinates changed by this much. Then programmatically, we have to change that through code. Okay, that's the process. So we're managing these X and Y coordinates. Okay, so I'm going to grab a pan gesture recognizer. I want it attached to the PDF. Everyone's good with that? Drag and drop it right onto the view that we want to be able to pan with. I need an event handler for that pan gesture recognizer. So I think, and I'm not positive of this, I just want to, I'm testing this. I don't usually do this, but I think, like normally I just create an action saying, hey, this file panned. So I set up an event handler. I think I can take this pan gesture recognizer and create an action for it. So PDF panned. And the type, I don't want any, I want a UI pan gesture recognizer. I still have to attach this gesture recognizer to the view controller and say, hey, this is one of my sent actions. And just to verify things are working, I just want to print panned. Normally I just programmatically create this function as a sender, but let's see what's going on. Nothing's happening. So this is where we get, like, I don't use this all that often. We're going to do drag and drop, and I forgot to enable user interaction. I'm not saying that that's the issue here, but like I know that that's an issue, right? So I need user interaction enabled for that PDF. I can promise you 100% of the time you'll forget that, right? Like I got other things going on. Like, is this how I wire up this gesture recognizer or not? And you forget about it. Okay, so now I try to run it. Hopefully this event handler gets triggered. Okay, so you'll notice that I'm getting that panned event handler. It's just printing a bunch of panned messages, but nothing's happening. Like I have to programmatically actually make this move around the screen. Like if I want to be able to drag and drop, I have to enable that. Like that's the code I have to write. Okay, so in order to do that, I'm going to get the translation. And I'm going to skip out of the assistant editor.
So was that thing just running that method anytime you moved even a pixel? Like
Yep.
Oh, man.
Yeah. But we can control that. Like so, we'll get there. Okay, so I need to know what that translation is. Like, how far did it move, and the terminology that iOS will use, and like that I would use now because my daughter's in 8th grade geometry is a translation. Like, how do I translate these X and Y coordinates based on this function, right? So I'm going to get a translation, and the way I'm going to get the translation is I'm going to get it from the sender, and I'm going to get the translation in self.view. How far did it move? Like, where did it move? And this translation then has X and Y coordinates. It's a point. Okay? So what I want to do with it is I want to get the view that I'm actually panning. So theoretically, I could have drag and drop enabled on all of my images. So like, let's say I had 10 images. I don't want to necessarily say, oh, it's that file image. And I don't want an outlet to the image. I only have an outlet to the logo right now. So I can programmatically determine which image is being panned on. So I'm going to get the image view. So if let view equals the sender dot view. So this sender will give me a view that's getting panned over. Then I want to change the view's center. And if I look at the center, you'll see it's a point. So let's describe the math, because the math is really not that hard. The translation is the change, right? Like how far did the x and y coordinates move? So what I want to do is I want to take the view, which is that file, like that PDF image view. I want to take its current x and y coordinates and modify them by the translation. Is everyone good with that? So I'm just going to add on the translation for the x and y coordinates. So if x was 0 and now it's 5, like x needs to be 5. Okay, so view.center will equal a CG point. And the way the point will work is x is going to be the view's center x plus the translation. Why is that not matching any overloads? Yeah, it should. And then the y's going to be the view's center y plus the translation's y. So I'm not asking you to do anything crazy with the math, right? Changed. Now you make an update. Now, if I've done this correctly, I think this should enable the drag and drop, but it's not necessarily going to look as smooth as we want it. Why am I getting that? One more time. Interesting. View.center. The reason why is because after I'm in the middle of a pan, so this was pointed out that you saw what I was printing, how many times it printed that pan, like, hey, I'm panning, I'm panning, I'm panning, I'm panning, and then there's different states to that panning, like am I starting, am I actually in the process of it, or am I done, like I've dropped it. So it's kind of like start drag, dragging, stop drag. Like those are the different states that we'll account for. The issue with that is this translation never resets. So as I'm moving it incrementally, like I have to reset the translation every time I've made the adjustment, right? Like I've adjusted the view center, and now it's time, like after I made that adjustment, now I don't need to adjust it again based on the previous adjustment. So I got to set the translation back to 0. Like there is no change now after I've adjusted for the change. Does that make sense? So the translation, the recognizer's translation, so sender's translation needs to be set to CG.0, 0, 0. There is no change in the view. So I'm basically resetting the translation to 0 every time I move the image. Is everyone following that math? If I move the image, now like there's nowhere for it to be changed. Like the translation should be 0 because I already adjusted for the change. So now, again, crossing my fingers, because if this doesn't work, you don't necessarily get errors or you don't find out.
So whenever you stop moving, or you stop the movement, that's where it readjusts to.
So when I let go of the mouse pointer, yeah.
Or wherever you pick up your finger on the screen.
Yep, then it's left there. Okay.
Mine stays pretty smooth even if you keep your mouse held down.
Yeah, I mean, it's not great.
I
Not what
mean,
you'd expect.
it doesn't like fly way off the screen though.
It's not an iOS thing. It's not as smooth as it should be on iOS, and like we can handle that. Part of it is that it's running on the simulator. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to be able to do two different things with this. So when I drag this, you'll see it goes behind the trash can image. How do I fix that? Like, why is that going behind the trash can? And like, if I'm going to enable this drag and drop where, like, the idea is that I should be able to delete my files. Like, this is a file that I'm going to drag on the trash can, and if I drag it onto the trash can, it should be deleted. Like, it really shouldn't go behind the trash can, right? Is everyone good with that? So if I go back over to the storyboard, we have the PDF and the trash. Can I just move these? That's not the way I handle it. Okay, so with two images, it's no big deal, right? Like, we can do that. What happens if I have 10 different files and I want to be able to drag them all? Can I determine which one should be first? Because let's say I had rows of 3, kind of like your calculator. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then I'm dragging and dropping. Like, whichever one I'm dragging really should be at the front, right? It should go over the top of all the other ones. So I can't organize my storyboard in any way that would make sense for that to happen. Not possible. So let's assume that it's not possible for me to rearrange these images. Okay, if I did, like, what's going to end up happening is, like, the last one that goes on is layered on top. Like, so there is a layering effect there, and you're seeing the layering effect, and we could adjust for it in this case. The correct solution is I can take the view, and then there's a bring subview to front. So the subview that I want is this view. So let's do that down below. So before we center it, we're going to bring it to front, and we're just bringing the view that we're working with. So we're getting the pan gesture recognizer's view, and we're bringing that to the front. That's how I'd read that. And this demo kind of loses its effect because, like, is this the code that's doing it, or is it still the storyboard that's doing it? And it's the code that's bringing that image view to the front. So I can assure you, if I don't have this code here, that this image view is going to go behind my trash can because of the way I've organized the images. See how it's going behind? So now the code will bring that subview to the front. So programmatically, we're bringing it to the front. Life's good there? Okay, so then let's handle a couple of different states. Okay, so if I'm looking at this gesture recognizer, I can switch on the sender's state. And the state will be, I need a curly brace here. I need a default break. And then I need a couple of different states. So I care about case began. So you'll notice it's a enumerated type. I care about when we began. And I also care about when it's changed. Then we want to do certain things. And I also care about when we've ended. I want to do certain things. So when it's beginning or changing, we want to make these translations. Okay. When it's ending, we need to decide, are we going to delete the file, or are we going to snap it back into place? Okay. Is everyone okay with snapping it back into place? How do we snap it back into place? Like, where are we snapping it back to?
Probably wherever it was when you started dragging it.
Yeah. So yeah, how do I have that information?
You have to get it right when you load the view. When you
So right when I load the view, I need that information. So I can do that in the Viewdidload, right? Okay, so if I'm going to do that in the Viewdidload, I'm going to want like an origin for that file. Okay, so in order to get the origin for the file, I need an outlet for that image view. Okay, so I'm breaking down, adding this outlet for my file. I'm just going to call it file. I guess I'll call it file image view. Okay, and I need an origin. So if I'm looking at this file image view, it's really a CG point, like the origin. So I'm going to have a variable called the origin that's a CG point. And I'm going to set the origin equal to the file image view dot what? How about dot center? Okay, so right when the view loads, I grab the center and I cache it in this origin variable. And what I'm going to do is down here in the end, like when the thing's ended, I'm going to snap back to the origin every time. Okay, that's not ultimately what I want to do. I want to be able to delete, but for now I'm going to snap back to the origin. How do I snap back to the origin?
you just set the center back to where it started.
Yeah, sure. View.center equals origin, self.origin. Okay, so we go ahead and run this. I have an error. There's no initializers. I don't really want an initializer. So I'm making that optional, so I don't have to have an initializer. And then in order to do that, I have to explicitly say, yep, there's an origin, otherwise I have to unwrap it. Okay, so I drag this around. That's not what I want. Why'd it do that?
Scope. Yeah. We'll bring the view out, bring the view in, the case began change.
Yeah, so I think I did a bad job of variable names here. So this variable view here is talking about the view that's getting panned. When I use the name view down below, it's the generic view for this view controller. Okay? And I really need a reference to this view. How do I fix that scope? Like most people's tendencies, I think, would be to do this, is to say, oh, I need to be able to access that variable outside of the switch statement, inside the switch statement, so I'm going to create a variable where I can reuse it, like in all of those different cases. I'm always of the mindset, keep variable scope as narrow as possible. Just do another if. Go retrieve it again. Okay, so now instead of moving the whole view, I'm hoping it just snaps back my logo. I don't necessarily like the look of how it's snapping back. Like we're kind of dragging it and then it just immediately snaps back. We can fix that too, right? So that it floats back. Remember last week when we were doing animations? Should we animate that? Animate with duration. Our time interval is going to be 0.5, so half a second. Let's do it 0.3 of a second. And then our animation is going to be this code. Again, you saw me create animations. I can't create animations, but this I can do. Right? Like if something's got to move and snap back, like you can animate it over a few seconds so that it looks nice. Like there's some things that just you can't screw up that bad. Now it moves back nice and smooth. Right? It's not annoyingly slow, right? Like it's not gonna sit and float where you're sitting waiting on it. Yeah, like this animation actually makes sense. We need to handle the delete, right? Okay, so the delete. I want to trigger the delete if this PDF is anywhere over this trash can. Okay? Fair enough. When it ends. Okay, so I'm going to check if they intersect. So I have the view, and then I can do a check. This is really going to be my else. Like I'm going to have a conditional. Let me get rid of the assistant editor again. This is if they're not intersecting. Like if the file image is not over the trash can, then I need to float back to the original position. Okay, so my conditional though is going to check, is it over the trash can? Okay, so my conditional is going to be if the view.frame.intersects my trash can's frame. Okay, I need a reference to my trash can now. I need an outlet so that I can actually refer to my trash can. So over at my storyboard, I pull up the assistant editor again. I need a reference to the trash can. Trash can image view. Now I have this reference. So if it intersects the self.trashcanImageView.frame, then I want to delete the thing. Otherwise, I want to snap back. And I'm missing a curly brace. And I wish that editor would actually indent correctly. Okay, so like if I'm running this right now, we should be able to see if it's working. And by that I mean, if it's over the trash can, it's not going to snap back. So right now it's intersecting with the trash can, it's going to stay. If it's not intersecting with the trash can, it'll snap back. So over the trash can, it's touching it all, it intersects. I thought it would. Notice it's not snapping back. But as soon as I get outside of that trash can frame, it snaps back to the origin. So we're able to detect when we should do the delete, right? What do we want to do for the delete? Get rid of it, right? Like somehow. Usually you don't remove things. Usually what'll end up happening is you'll just like set them to transparent essentially. So if I take the view and I set the alpha is the transparency equal to 0. It's a float, so 0.0. And again, I'm going to hint at this, but might be a good spot for an animation.
Does that mean it's still there and you can drag it back off the trash can accidentally?
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you make that not happen?
You can send it to the back.
Oh.
Yeah. And usually that's what ends up happening. So I'm going to animate that removal. That's our pan gesture recognizer. Okay. It's another easy one. Swiping, right? Like I want to swipe left to right. And maybe that's how you control your navigation, or maybe you're creating some app like a dating app where you can swipe left or right or up or down, whatever. You can use a gesture recognizer to do it. So if I go back over to my storyboard, I'm going to be able to swipe on my Wildcat logo. Doesn't make any sense, but in order to do that, I'm going to grab a swipe gesture recognizer. I'm going to drag it onto the image again. This swipe gesture recognizer will let you determine the direction. So if I swipe right, user interactions enabled on this image already. So I don't have to wire that up again. If I bring up my assistant editor, I can now set up an event handler for my swipe gesture recognizer. Image swiped. And I think I still have to connect it to the view controller, but let's try not to. I was debating whether I have to or not, but so we'll find out. So with this, I have to press and swipe. So it's kind of with my trackpad, I'm swiping to the right, swiping to the right, swiping to the right. If I swipe to the left, nothing happens. Up and down, nothing happens. It's only to the right. It's hard to see now because I'm just repeating the same thing. But if I click and drag to the right, I'm swiping to the right. If I click and drag to the left, nothing's happening. These used to be so hard to use. Like you had to programmatically do it and set up the event handlers and stuff like that. And now it's just like, oh no, you can just drag and drop it onto the image. It's easy. You can still programmatically do it, and I don't think it's necessarily a problem to programmatically do it, but I'd argue that it's not necessarily as intuitive as setting it up in the storyboard.
I bought a book like a long time ago, like iOS 4. I tried to do some of this stuff and it was in Objective-C, a language I didn't know. And it was always archaic. Like,
Yeah. No.
crazy.
Like it wasn't anything that you did. That's just the way it was.
Yeah, I know.
Like it was, yeah, it was bad. So these are the gesture recognizers. There's a few others like rotate. Like I don't think I could code rotate. Like I can get a rotation angle, I'm sure. And I'm sure it's just a translation again, but I don't think I could code it up. A lot of times you'll see like that double tap to zoom. So what ends up happening is like the gesture recognizers kind of mimic the Mac trackpads. Right? You don't want to be too crazy with your gesture recognizers.
How would you recognize swiping in the other direction?
So if I wanted to swipe in another direction, I'd go to the storyboard. I need a reference to the swipe gesture recognizer. I could change it right here, or I could set up an outline, an outlet to it, and then change it programmatically.
So you just have multiple swipe gestures for left, right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Simple.
Yep. And who knows what you're doing there, right? Like you could transition to a segue. Like we're being really kind of cavalier about the code, like saying, hey, I triggered this, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is like maybe that's the way I want to set up my navigation. If it's a dating app, I swipe left, swipe right, like whatever. Like this is after my scene, right? Like Tinder and stuff like that, but that's what it is, right? Like you just swipe. Yeah, I like this person or I don't. Swipe left, swipe right. Like that's what they're doing, is like it's triggering a segue to a new image, or it's just loading another image. Like I have no idea. My wife wouldn't appreciate me having the app. It's for research, right? It's for iOS, yeah.
Ask your kids, they probably know.
No, they're too young yet, but yeah. Yeah, so we're being pretty cavalier about what code goes in there. Like the translation, the panning, I think is pretty typical of code that would go into one of these gesture recognizers. Like if I'm going to rotate something, like there's more to it, right? Or if I'm going to trigger a segue, there's more to it. Or okay. So I'm going to stop here for gesture recognizers. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll get into system view controllers.